Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Shabbos Daf Kuf Lamed begins a new parak, the chapter called Rabbi Elazar de Mila. It is a discussion of the halachos of bris milah, specifically bris milah on Shabbos, but also bris milah in general. And we got into the subject here because the last Mishnah in the previous chapter talked about medical treatments, and it ended off with the fact that you're allowed to do anything involved in a bris milah on Shabbos. So the Gemara is going to open with the Mishnah. Of course, the Mishnah will introduce us to a basic machlokas as to what you're allowed to do for the sake of a bris milah on Shabbos. The Gemara will discuss the idea which we've seen in the Mishnah that you have to make sure that no one suspects you of doing something wrong in this inyan. Then the Gemara will try to figure out who the halacha is like, and the Gemara will sidestep into a brief agadata about the importance and the significance of certain mitzvahs and how we're supposed to treat them. And then on the concept of bringing knives for Emila, we'll get into a lengthy discussion about Eruv Chatzeres, combining multiple Chatzeres to be able to carry from one to the other or within one Chatzer, and Shitufei Mavois, carrying from one alley to another alley. So let's begin the Mishnah. And we have a basic machlokes here between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, who's actually his Talmud. The machlokes is about what are you allowed to do in order to be able to have a bris milah occur on Shabbos. So the basic milah itself is chilul Shabbos, but that you're allowed to do, that's for sure, that we see clearly. The question is, are you allowed to do things which you could have done before Shabbos, but you didn't get a chance to do before Shabbos, so you're allowed to do them if they involve chilul Shabbos? So Rabbi Eliezer says, yes, you're allowed to do them before Shabbos. You should just be careful to avoid suspicion. So therefore, you should carry, if you need to bring the special milah knife, you should carry it through the street exposed. Everybody should see that it's a milah knife. You shouldn't hold a bag with something in it. That way they'll know that you're bringing it. The reason why you're carrying on Shabbos is because you're on the way to do a bris milah. Now, if it's a time of danger, sakana, such as when the local rules did not allow you to do a bris milah at all, so you can't walk around in the street with a milah knife, so then you can carry it in a bag. Just make sure you have two witnesses see that that's what it is before you set out, and perhaps also after you arrive. But they should see, you should have witnesses that should see that it's clearly a milah knife that you are doing, and that's why you're carrying in the street. Okay, now Rabbi Akiva's opinion, though, is that you can't do anything which you could have done on Shabbos which you could have done before Shabbos in order to prepare. The only thing you're allowed to do is the actual milah itself, which is chil Shabbos. Okay, now the Gemara wants to know about this last halacha here, that you're supposed to carry it exposed, but when it's time of sakana, danger, you can carry it with only two witnesses. The Gemara's question now is, what about if I have two witnesses when it's not a danger? Can I rely on two witnesses that no one should suspect me of carrying on Shabbos? So the Gemara says, well, it depends what the reason for carrying it exposed is. Is it because of chavivus of the mitzvah, to show how beloved it is? You want everybody to see that you're on the way to doing a milah? If that would be the case, then you shouldn't be allowed to carry with witnesses. If the only concern, though, was because of suspicion, so then the witnesses should help to alleviate that, even if there is no sakana. So the Gemara brings a couple of different versions of Rabbi Eliezer's statement, which clearly show that you should not be relying on witnesses unless you have to, and therefore there must also be an element of showing the belovedness of the mitzvah of milah. So what are those other versions of the statement? So first of all, Rabbi Levi says that Rabbi Eliezer's reasoning was to show the love for the mitzvah. We have a brisa that says you can bring it exposed and you cannot bring it covered. That shows that you're not allowed to unless you are forced to. Rav Ashi says, if you look carefully at the wording of our Mishnah, that also shows that. It says that only during a time of danger you're allowed to bring it covered in a bag, but not other times. Another brisa says as follows: you can bring it exposed, but you can't bring it covered. That's Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. Rabbi Huda says, the name of Rabbi Eliezer, that when it was dangerous, they would bring it covered with witnesses. So you see that unless it's specifically in that situation, you're not allowed to rely on witnesses. You should carry it exposed to also show your love for the mitzvah. Okay, now the Gemara has a question about these witnesses. You need two witnesses besides the person carrying the knife, or can he count as one of the witnesses? That would mean you have only one witness. Usually, to prevent people from being suspicious, one witness is enough. So Gemara says, well, if you look carefully at the wording, it says he could bring it with witnesses. That sounds like it's two other ones. Versus no, maybe it means two witnesses that are okay to testify about something else, meaning two kosher witnesses that aren't related to each other, and he could be one of them, but you really only need one witness. Besides, for him, he should just be somebody who is kosher to testify with him, and therefore is kosher to testify on him. Okay, now the Gemara goes into who the halacha is like. And the Gemara quotes a brisa which says that the halacha is not like Rabbi Eliezer. You're not allowed to bring anything through Rosh Hashanah carrying violin and Concise Shabbos that you could have brought it before Shabbos. However, in Rabbi Eliezer's town, they followed his minhag. As a matter of fact, they even went so far, and this we saw in the Mishnah as well, as to chop down trees in order to burn them, to make coal, in order to make iron, to make a milah knife. You could do that all on Shabbos. Now, on a similar note, the Brisa says that Rabbi Yossi Haglili was of the opinion that there is no prohibition of cooking or eating milk together with fowl meat, together with the meat of a bird. And in his town, they followed that halacha. Now, the Gemara says that Levi went to the house of Yosef, the bird catcher, and he brought him a pheasant cooked in milk, and he didn't want to eat from it. And he later came to Rebbe, and Rebbe said, "Why don't you put him into chayrim? It's forbidden to do something like that. You have to excommunicate somebody like that." So he says, "Well, I didn't want to do that because the town was the place where Rebbe Yehuda ben Meseir was the Rav. And I thought that maybe Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseir holds like Rabbi Yossi Haglili, and Rabbi Yossi Haglili holds you're allowed to do that. Where do we see that? Mishnah, Nechulin. Rabbi Yossi Haglili says, what does the prohibition of cooking in milk apply to? We know that it applies to anything that the Isser Nevela applies to, meaning anything which requires proper slaughter, which includes domesticated animals, wild animals, and birds. How do we know that? Because the same pasuk that says don't eat Nevela also says don't cook meat and milk together. However, you might think that therefore includes birds, but there is a different proof that it doesn't include birds. That's only meant to include both types of animals. Birds are excluded because it says you shouldn't cook it in its mother's milk, and birds don't have milk. So therefore we don't have any prohibition for cooking birds. Now the Gemara, going back to Rabbi Eliezer, says there was one city in Eretz Yisrael that followed Rabbi Eliezer's halacha, and people there never died young. They lived their full lifespan, and not only that, but whenever there was a rule banning bris milah, it never applied to the city. That city was always escaped from that rule. So you see, there seemed to be some special schus that he had. Now the Gemara slips into a bit of a gadati here. The Gemara says, Rishon ben Gamliel says in a brisa, any mitzvah which Klal Yisrael accepted with joy, like the mitzvah of milah, then they do very strongly today. Anyone which they accepted with arguing, they're still arguing about it today. Where do you see that they accepted the mitzvah of milah with joy, like the pasuk says in Tehillim, I rejoice over your word, like somebody who found great wealth. Your word refers to your first word, the first mitzvah that was given as a Jewish mitzvah, which is the mitzvah of bris milah, which was given to Avram Avinu in Parshas Vayera. We're joyful over that. Rashi says we even make a simcha every time we do a bris milah, and therefore we're still happy over it. However, the one that we fought about was the halachos of marriage. Arayas, who you're allowed to marry and who you're not allowed to marry. We still fight over that because there is no marriage, there is no ksuba that's written that doesn't have some element of arguing between the parties involved before it's properly executed. Okay, now on similar subject, the Gemara has a brisa. Rishon ben Elazar says, any mitzvah which Klal Yisrael were willing to sacrifice their lives for, such as bris milah and avoiding avodah zarah, they are still strong on those mitzvahs. Bris milah is still strong, and avodah zarah avoidance is still strong, no matter who you are, where you are in the Jewish nation. However, mitzvahs which were weak, which we started off weekly with, we are still weak on, and that an example of that is tefillin. And now the Gemara quotes the famous story of Elisha Baknafayim, which was brought earlier in the Masechta on Daf Mem Tes, and also we saw it in Masechtas Brachos. The says there was a fellow by the name of Elisha Baknafayim who went out and violated the orders of the king. The king had ordered that no Jew is allowed to wear tefillin, and if he does wear tefillin and he's caught, he will have his brain poked out of his skull through the place where the tefillin is. And Elisha didn't care. He went on the street with his tefillin on until he was spotted by an officer. So he fled, and the officer chased him. And when he cornered him, he took his tefillin off, he held it in his hands, and covered it with his hands, and the man said, what is that in your hands? And he said, oh, it's just pigeon wings. He opened his hands, and his tefillin had turned into pigeon wings, and therefore his life was spared. And the says, why pigeon wings of all things? The says, because the yena, the pigeon, the dove, is like the Jewish people. Just like the dove is protected by his wings, Rashi says it means he fights with his wings. So too our mitzvahs protect us, like the pasuk says, Kanfei yoina nechba bakesef evreiseha birakrak chorutz. The rest of the daf discusses the halachas of carrying the knife and which zones one is permitted to carry the knife through in order to reach the place where the meal is meant to happen. So let's have a brief introduction as to the different zones as far as carrying on Shabbos. So first of all, the highest level or the lowest level, the easiest place to carry is within your own house. That's not an issue. It's a Rishus HaYachid. Then you're allowed to carry from your house into your own courtyard, which is walled. It's also a Rishus HaYachid. The next level up would be a shared courtyard where there are other houses that open into the yard. It will be forbidden to carry from the house out into the yard, or possibly even within the yard. We shall see that's a machlokes, without an Erev Chaseres. Erev Chaseres combines all the yards into belonging to one consortium, and therefore you would be allowed to carry within it. Beyond that is the mavoi, that's the alley the various courtyards open into. You would need another combination, another type of Erev called the Shitufe Mavois, combination of the courtyards that open into the mavoi. Mavoi is the alley, in order to be able to carry within the mavoi if it is shared. Now, mavoi also needs something at its entrance so that you would be able to separate it from the Rishus Harabim, some kind of stick or symbol. Otherwise, you wouldn't be allowed to carry there at all, midrabanan, even if you had the proper Erev. Beyond that, you have Carmelisin. Carmelisin are areas where you aren't allowed to carry unless you have an Erev, meaning an enclosure. Carmelis could include a karfeif, a field which people don't live in, or various other areas which aren't Rishus Harabim. And the highest level, of course, is a Rishus Harabim, which is a public thoroughfare for public use, which may or may not need to have 600,000 people using it. That's also a machlokes. So now, the Gemara begins by quoting a statement of Rav Abba bar Ad and Rav Yitzchak, who says that one time they forgot to bring the knife before Shabbos. Of course, we know that the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva, you're supposed to bring the knife before Shabbos, but they forgot, and they went and they brought the knife through the fields and the roofs, which are Carmelisin and Rishusei HaYachid. So the statement concludes and says this was not in according to the will of Rabbi Eliezer. Sumer says, what do you mean? They brought the knife through the yards, through the fields. That is in accordance with the will of Rabbi Eliezer. He's the one who says you're even allowed to carry it through the street. So the Gemara says, no, we mean that wasn't according with the will of Rabbi Eliezer, because he would have said he could have just bring it to the Rishus Harabim. This was according to the will of the Rabbanon, who said he can't bring it to Rishus Harabim, you have to bring it through the yards and the fields and the gardens. So Gemara says, what do you mean? But the Rabbanon say that you can't bring it to the yards and fields and gardens. They don't even allow you to do that. Even though it's only Nisar, the Rabbanon, you're not allowed to do that. We have a brisa that says you're not allowed to do that. So Gemara says, you're right. It's not in according... It's not, when we say it's not in accordance with the will, we don't mean Rabbi Eliezer or the Chachamim. Rabbi Eliezer would have said you can carry it through Rishus Harabim. The Chachamim, who are Rabbi Akiva, would have said you can't carry it anywhere. It was in accordance with the will of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon is about a different subject. He says you're always allowed to carry within a chutzner without having an Erev Chaseres, meaning he says the following halacha. This has nothing to do with Mila. He would say this referring to anything. You're allowed to carry an object from one end of a chutzner to another, even though it is a jointly owned chutzner. You don't have to have an Erev Chaseres. According to him, the only time you have to have an Erev Chaseres is if an object started off Shabbos in somebody's house. You take it out of the house into the yard, then you need to have an Erev Chaseres, and of course if you did that, you also have to have an Erev Chaseres to move it around within the yard. But if it started Shabbos in the yard, you're allowed to move it to the other end of the yard. You don't have to have an Erev Chaseres. That's not what Erev Chaseres is about, according to Rabbi Shimon, and that's what we're referring to here. Not only does he say that within the yard, he even says it from the yards to other types of Rishusei Hayachid, such as roofs, and he even adds karfifos, that you're allowed to carry in all these areas. You don't have to have an Erev Chaseres, therefore there's no problem. and therefore that is the opinion that they followed when they carried this milah knife through those areas. Okay, now the Gemara asks, according to this opinion of Rabbi Shimon, are you allowed to carry from one end of an alley to another end of an alley? Meaning, an alley also requires an Erev. It requires an Erev called a Shetufei Mavos, to combine the owners of the houses and the various different chatzeros that open into the alley. If you didn't do that, according to him, an object which started Shabbos at one end of the alley, can you carry to the other end of the alley? We know he says that you are allowed to from one end of the yard, the chatzer, to the other end of the chatzer. But maybe that's different. Maybe that's because the Chatzar has walls, but Mavoi doesn't have all the walls. It only has 3 walls. Midrabanan, you need to have something else. Or perhaps a Chatzar has houses that open into it, so people use it more often, and a Mavoi might be different. What's the halacha? So the Gemara says that this question, which was asked by Rav Zeir to Rav Asi, he didn't answer him. But sometime later, he saw Rav Asi, who was sitting and he was teaching, and he said, Rav Shimon ben Lakish says as follows, that Rav Yehuda Hanasi once forgot to bring a milah knife before Shabbos, and they brought it, and the Chachamim were not happy about this. They said, what do you mean? How did you bring a knife on Shabbos? You rejected the words of the Chachamim, who are the Rabbim, the majority, and you went with Rabbi Eliezer. Not only is he the minority, but he's even a Chayrim. Rabbi Eliezer was put into Chayrim because of the incident of the Tanur Shalachnai in Mesaches Baba Metzia. So how are you allowed to do that? And Rav Oishi said, I asked Rabbi Yehuda, who is a special expert in Milah, and he said that the situation was that it was a mavoi. They just carried it from one end of a mavoi to the other, an alley, and it didn't have a shetufim mavoi, didn't have an erev, but they were allowed to bring it from one end to the other. So when Rabbi Zeir heard Rav Asi say this over, he said, hold on a second. I once asked you, are you allowed to bring from one end of the mavoi to the other, and you didn't answer me. But I see that you do know. So maybe what happened is that when I asked you, you didn't think of it, but now as you were learning, it drew the memory forth. So he says, yeah, that's what happened. As I was teaching the sugya, it brought the memory forward again. It reminded me about this halacha. Okay, the Gemara now begins a lengthy discussion in the halachos of mavois, alleys, which will take us deep into the next stuff, but we'll begin it here. The halacha is that a mavoi, because it opens into the Rishos Harabim, one is not supposed to carry even within the mavoi itself unless there is some kind of symbol at the entrance to the mavoi to show that it is different than the Rishos Harabim. You need either a beam or a side post, crossbar, all three, something along those lines. So the Gemara over here says that Rabbi Zeira said in the name of Rav, that if you have a mavoi, you have an alley that has no shitufei mavois, they did not do an erev, then you are only allowed to carry within 4 amas there. So the Gemara first has a hard time understanding this. Abaye says Rabbi Zeira said this, and we didn't understand it until Rabbi Baravu came and he explained it. Because Rav Nachman said it over, and the name of Rabbi Baravu, and the name of Rav, he said as follows. This is referring to a mavoi in which there is an erev chatzeris between the houses and the yards they open into. But there is no erev, there is no shitufim mavais, which is between the chatzeris that open into the alley. That means, remember, the streets in the days of Chazal had a number of houses that all opened into the same yard, a number of yards that all opened onto the same alley, and a number of alleys that all opened onto the same main Rosh Hashanah street. So here you have the houses, the various houses that open into the yard made a Erev Chatzeris, but the yards didn't make an Erev, a Shetufim Mavois, that open into the Mavoi. So, therefore, the situation is as follows. The Gemara's first explanation is, because the Chatzeris have an Erev, the Chatzer all becomes considered to be part of the one house where the Erev is. Therefore, the entire Chatzer has the status of a house. So you end up having a house that opens directly into the Mavoi, because the yard that it opens into is considered to be part of that. That's how an Erev Chatzeris works. And we know that the halach is that you're not allowed to make a Shetufim Mavois unless you have yards opening into Mavois. Having houses opening into Mavois doesn't work. Therefore, there's no Shetufim Mavois here, and you wouldn't be allowed to carry in the Mavoi itself. That's the Gemara's interim explanation. The Gemara is going to reject that swiftly and go on to other understandings, but we shall leave that for Daf Kuf.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.